then talk about its American antecedents. So Francis Galton is the person who gives us the word, and you saw in your article today that there was Charles Galton Darwin who was being quoted, who was a grandson of Charles Darwin, who was a cousin of Francis Galton, who was named for both, who was a physicist, who was himself a eugenicist later in life. But he's a contemporary of Spencer, whom we've talked about at length, a cousin of Darwin, who had influenced him deeply. He is the first modern statistician. He is a polymath who, like many people in the 19th century, covered many areas and developed many useful ideas, but as often is the case with polymaths, some ideas have stood the test of time better than others. But he coins the term eugenics, which, as we know from Professor Starks, means happily born, and also the term nature versus nurture. And I believe that Starks mentioned his book Hereditary Genius, saying, how do geniuses come about? They come about from being born to other geniuses, and his object of study was his own family, which was an intellectually distinguished family for about 5 generations, but there was absolutely no allowance there that of also being landholders and having the assets that allowed them to be people of leisure and to pursue intellectual interests might have helped them along in that. But to give you an idea of how respectable Galton is, he's knighted in 1909. There is a Galton Chair in Eugenics founded at University College London in his name. A second person that we'll see on the American side who comes in the next generation is Charles Davenport. Davenport, again, Harvard PhD. He is a professor of zoology. He is a great proponent of Mendel's genetic laws, believing that human heredity must be like Mendel's peas, meaning as they understood it at the time, that there is a one-to-one genetic direct correspondence between a trait and a gene. We now know this is not the case for many things. But he founds the Eugenic Records Office in 1910, looking at how can we make Americans healthier, better. He's a fellow of the National Academy of Science. He writes the book Heredity in Relation to Eugenics in 1911. It goes through 5 editions in its first 12 years as a popular college textbook. So these theories that I'm about to get into and show you some examples of were out there in the culture. And he was funded by serious scientific organizations. So the Carnegie Institution, it funds him until 1935. Notice the telling year. Serious scientists had begun to question his research about a decade before that, but it is with the rise again of Nazism in Germany that more serious people pull away. But he's also funded by the founder of the Junior League. And again, we can see the sort of class interest in seeing that if we tell ourselves that the poor have themselves to blame for their condition, and yes, we're going to see that pauperism is hereditary in a second, you can see why there might be incentive for very wealthy people to support this. And the last of our eugenics intellectuals, and you could go through a big list of these people, is Madison Grant, whom Anna has had to read through, and Dane, because I teach him in our Honors Humanities project 3rd semester. But he's a good example of an American eugenicist. He's an amateur, he's a lawyer, but a devoted naturalist. He likely saved the deer in New York State. He was fundamental to saving the redwoods and the great sequoias in California. He's a trustee of the American Museum of Natural History, where he represents the standpoint of evolutionary anthropology. He will be opposed by Franz Boas, whose views went out in the end, thankfully. But he's a friend of Teddy Roosevelt. He is a friend of Herbert Hoover. He has direct access through his Harvard ties, his class ties. He's from a wealthy New York family, to leaders and policymakers. His passion after deer and the redwoods was restricting immigration, because he believed that immigration and immigrants' bad genes would destroy America. He sums this up in his book, The Passing of the Great Race, which comes out in 1916. and sells 17,000 copies in its first 20 years. That's a lot of books in a country of 80 to 100 million people at the time, to be selling on a topic that is, purported to be a science topic. Hitler referred to the book as his Bible, and we will talk about Herr Hitler a little more later on in this too, and where he gets his ideas from. Again, this only really falls out of popularity with the rise of the Nazis. But Grant's contribution will be where we will wrap up probably at the end of tomorrow, is in the deep relationship that eugenicists had with immigration restriction, something that continues today and that continued on, as we see in the interests of Hackett in the article today, who was both someone with eugenic Darwinist overtones and someone who was a passionate advocate of restricting immigration to the US. So what do we mean when we say eugenics? We mean two kinds of programs. Starks ran through this quickly, so I'm just going to do the same. Positive eugenics means giving the right kind of people, incentive to procreate through more education, through tax incentives, so that we're giving you money if you have more babies, and through appeals to patriotism, positive motivation as opposed to guilt, that good people are producing babies for the fatherland or for Uncle Sam or fill in the blank. Negative eugenics is what we think of more commonly. This is birth control. I told you the story of how proud I was that when I worked for the American Friends Service Committee, we opened the first rural birth control clinic in America. And then after I started studying eugenics, realized it kind of raises some questions that a wealthy Philadelphia organization is opening its first birth control clinic in rural West Virginia. Why? Yes. Sterilization is the second popular method. We're going to talk about that. Abortion, the forced abortion. This was less often done, but was certainly done in Germany. And finally, euthanasia. And of course, we associate this with the Nazi death camps, with Madison Grant, 1916, is saying, but this is probably too far for Americans, but if we would not only ghettoize, but then euthanize the unfit people of America, instead of eliminating the problem in 3 to 4 generations, we could do it in 1 to 2. Wow. So this is something that we are deeply implicated in culturally. Give you a little timeline, and again, Starks went over some of this. Indiana gave us our first sterilization law in the world, not Germany, not Tojo's Japan, Indiana. The first International Congress of Eugenics was held in 1912. The important thing, gathering of scientists from over the world, 80% of the scientists were American. Now put this against the context of Jim Crow laws, anti-miscegenation laws of the period. America was always a eugenics leader. We consider these to be racist laws when we think about them in most discussions, but these were eugenic policies as well. It's in 1917 that the first new IQ tests are developed for soldiers, and they say that the average soldier is a moron of mid-grade intelligence. Again, these were based on class-based knowledge, that knowing the parts and names of makes of vehicles is not something that's happening to rural poor people. And literally, what kind of engine is in a what is one of the questions on one of these.
I guess we'd all be morons.
We'd all be morons. But honors colleges, and this is a good takeaway, honors education is deeply implicated in and tied to the history of these movements, that we believe there are natively intelligent people who should have extra resources put into them. And so we get up every morning at the University of Arkansas Honors College and try to do that. And this has been a fantastic time for colleges and universities to be examining some of those assumptions. 1921, Margaret Sanger makes that quote below about the campaign for birth control, because she's trying to get birth control approved. Remember, we think of Planned Parenthood today, mostly in the context of abortion, but Planned Parenthood begins about providing birth control, which was not legal in that period, and which no church endorsed until the mid-1930s. And even then, it was the Anglicans who were liberal even then. So, context. She says, yes, this is, birth control is eugenic in value, but its aims are identical with the final ends of the eugenics movement. And I say that not to bash Margaret Sanger. I throw this in here every year because people are always like, Planned Parenthood is a eugenic organization. Margaret Sanger's comment is not remarkable because she had eugenic ideas. Those were the ideas of progressive people, of the people like we're finding on this class today at the time. So don't think that Margaret Sanger was some special monstrous villain in a cloak. She was just representative of what anyone who would be a modern member of the Church of Terry Gross shopping at Whole Foods would think today. 1929, the Supreme Court upheld forced sterilization, which we already talked about a little bit with Starks. By 1938, 30 states have mandatory sterilization laws, and in some places, like in California, sterilizations of morons, which could be as simple as being a young woman who had gotten pregnant. 30 states have those laws. But, and we forget this, 1948, 30 states still retain anti-miscegenation laws. Racial intermarriage was illegal in 30 states and will not be finally struck down and pushed out of the last states in the Confederacy until the late 1960s versus Virginia. So when you look at Jim Crow policy in the context of these times, you begin to see it differently. And many people say, you know, in the progressive era, how was it that all of these Southerners in the sort of era before World War I, immediately after, when all of these great things are happening in public health, how is it that so many Southerners were in favor of the progressive movement? Well, because progressives were in favor of eugenics and did not have the best record on race. This is an example of the kind of propaganda that was used in the period. This is the famous case of a woman named Ada Jukes that scientists, I think from Cornell, or may have been Columbia, do the first study, early sociologists say, if you look at this one poor family in the mountainous regions of New York, I mean, remember the Appalachians begin in New York State. They have their own mountain culture too. It is not all Sex in the City. This was Sex in the Country. They said if you'd sterilized this one woman in 1740, you would have gotten rid of 64 mentally ill people, 174 sex perverts. I'd love to know how they define that.
Yeah, really.
196 illegitimates, 142 poplars, and 77 criminals and murderers, because all of those were a direct consequence of her genes. Again, this Mendelian idea, and this is a fault that he should have known better in the 1968 article today, making assumptions about heritable characteristics that simply are not true.
Dr. Tree?
Yes.
Clearly, most of these sterilizations were performed on women, even though that is a much more complicated procedure than sterilizing a male. What were these procedures being done on men?
Yes, men were sterilized as well. But, you know, if you sterilize a woman, and I'm speaking obviously tongue in cheek in the thinking of the period, if you sterilize a woman, you're just neutralizing the parts that make her crazy. But if you sterilize a man, you're taking away the parts that make him a man. And so it was very sexist in the way it was applied. No one thought that men were doing anything unusual if they impregnated a woman out of wedlock, but a woman who allowed that to happen to herself was no lady, no good woman, and someone who probably should be sterilized. This is a poster from the American Eugenics League, and just see, you know, the traits that are listed as heritable: feeble-mindedness, insanity, alcoholism, but pauperism, you know, being poor. Yes, being poor is inherited, but you did not get it from your parents' genes.
But it seems like they're also blaming illegitimate children for their own births.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They were hopeless. And I love this triangle, and this eugenic triangle, the triangle of life, was used in a number of publications. I've come across it in several places. And it's the three things that contribute to, you know, how your state of life Environment is what you have, education is what you do, but heritage, genetics is what you are. It is intrinsic, it is the unchangeable, overriding thing. I'll go one more slide and then I'll pop it up for a second. I'm going to close this part with simply looking at, this is a New York Times article from 1913. The Times was not the paper that it is today, but it was already a very respectable paper. And here is a banner headline from the Times saying 15 million children are defectives. And if you read this article and others like it, you'll see that a large number of them are Jews, Southern Europeans, and African Americans. And so this was normative thinking within American culture for a very long time. And I'm not sure that we can say we have entirely escaped this to this day. In fact, I would argue strongly that we have not. And we will finish up the eugenics movement and its implications tomorrow. But does anyone have any
Just some questions. In the chat.
Let me get back to gallery. There we go. Yes, I have recorded. Sterilization of men was more common. Oh, yes, for homosexual men, absolutely, Cassidy. Homosexual men, of course, again, it follows the same reasoning as with women. If you were a gay man, you were intrinsically disordered, language that the Catholic moral philosophy still uses today. If you look at the encyclicals of John Paul II and also Benedict, and also of Francis, who gets a free pass in the
Not
press.
from you, man.
You know, homosexual men were only going to use their sexuality in deviant ways, and so sterilizing them, they're not men, they're not natural to begin with, and so yes, gay men were sterilized. The most famous case being, I'm forgetting his name, from A Beautiful Mind.
Oh, yes.
Alan Turing.
Yeah.
Is this news to most of you, or are we doing a better job teaching this in high school and college now?
That's a good question.
Because I know that Dean Kuhn and I did not get any of this in high school and
No.
college.
No, no. I think I have a hand up.
Dane, you heard it all before.
So I noticed you said the first eugenic law was in Indiana, and I think also Indiana was one of the hotbeds of like the KKK resurgence in the early 20th century. So what's the deal with Indiana?
Yeah, this is a lecture actually that is a two-parter that is a combination of, I talk about how working class, lower middle class Americans in this period were managing their anxiety through the second Ku Klux Klan, which had 5 million to 7 million members and dominated several states in places like Indiana, Oregon, Colorado, not just the South. Indiana, in the case of the eugenics laws, I do not know enough of the history. I know enough culturally of why Indiana was embracing the Klan, which has to do with it being a small farmer place that has a profile that is much more similar to the rural South in many ways, and also a religious profile that's more similar to the rural South. Why at the upper level they're embracing eugenics? Is it because you've got an elite that has enough? I don't know. I don't know. Cassie, some law in Missouri that allowed people to murder Mormons. Oh, you're getting into one of my other. Let's see, I'm making the assumption that mass forced sterilization by states is not occurring today. Not any longer, but I'm going to show you just how long it went on and how prominent it was. Some law in Missouri that allowed people to kill Mormons for burial. No, that was all vigilante violence. Mormons are another thing I did. That was vigilante violence. But the governor of the state was endorsing killing Mormons for political reasons about a century earlier, in the early 19th century. I read about it with the eugenic movement. Bizarre history overall. Yeah, well, part of this is suppressed because eugenics, we all know the Nazis ruined eugenics for everyone. And thank heavens they did. But we do not like to think in our framing of World War II, we are the good people standing up for the rights of everyone. And they are the monsters who did these things, not that we opened our borders and allowed persecuted people into the US during World War II. But eugenics was something that we so thoroughly othered. I think most Americans have generally forgotten that it was something we invented, practiced, believed in.
And in fact, I was just reading about historically Black colleges and universities, you probably know this story, basically importing Jewish professors in the 30s to teach at HBCUs, recognizing that the kind of discrimination that was going on against Jews in Nazi Germany opened a space for importing some pretty impressive intellectuals that then would go on to teach in historically Black colleges. It's quite a story.
Yeah, I don't know that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's from my Hayward research.
I've got to look at this.
Yeah.
But
Interesting.
I knew that was the thing, and we will talk specifically about the Jim Crow laws tomorrow in this part of class, so stay tuned. One last question, we're running over, Ethan. Yeah, you did. Well, if you didn't hear it, you went to Fayetteville High School, right, Ethan? That's probably a good
Yes.
barometer that most other people aren't hearing it either.
Really? Wow. Oh, well, you just, because everyone's allowed to focus on the Nazis, right? Which basically is a cover up of our own history.
Yeah,
That's
this
kind of
is,
how history works, isn't it, Dr. Treat?
this is why in that class, I don't talk about the Nazis really at all, because everyone will fixate on, I wouldn't have been a Nazi, I would have been the good people.
Right,
And the
right.
next generation, I would have marched with Dr. King. I try to spend a semester with 40 honor students, showing them all the mistakes people like us actually made from the time of Bacon up to the 20th century, and maybe a little into the 20th first, because we close out with P.K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is the basis for the Blade Runner movies.
All right.
All right.
I think Josephine gets the close.
Josephine, last one.
Like, because you mentioned how obviously they're not doing sterilization anymore. I don't know how recently it stopped, but they're not doing it anymore. But I saw like the court case, like the Buffy Bell court case, like it was upheld, and I'm not sure if it's been overturned since then. But does that mean that there's still sterilization laws on the books in any states today that just aren't being applied?
They may still be on the books. They're not being practiced today. There are some questions about bodily autonomy, especially in light of Roe, that would give someone a good defense today that was not available then. But Buck v. Bell has never been officially overturned. And then if Roe, the basis for our privacy and bodily autonomy laws, is overturned, it raises interesting theoretical questions that, so far as I know, no one is attempting to bring back sterilization yet.
Yeah. Historians we're very jaded, so notice the yet.
Yes, because everything old is new again, the good and the bad things. People in subsequent generations say the same thing about us and some of our cultural ideas. Yes, they will, John. I'm going to talk about this in the second half tomorrow, so bring that back up specifically. This is great. And Dean Kuhn and I both love this argument. You got to be very careful how you judge historical figures, because it's coming for you one day.
Correct. Even if you were in your own time the great hero, so what?
Everywhere, as I like to say, everyone was homophobic until 5 minutes ago, and you can historically, and then you can apply that forward to issues we have not considered yet. And I think we've got to take it there. Thank you, everyone, for a super engaged, lovely class again today. You've all been magnificent.
Awesome! Stay tuned tomorrow. We are going to do the ethics of drones. Woo!
Supply chain.